when I was asked by Pat Clear to speak to you today, I really felt overwhelmed. I said, well, sure, that's really a super thing. And then the topic was on Africa, on black history. And then I began to look at some things in the Atlantic African slave trade began in the 1500s. And it ended in the 19th century, the 16th century. And so I reasoned that that was it was over 500 years ago. And it ended in the 19th century, which is nearly 200 years ago. And then I reasoned that Pat only gave me 20 minutes to talk about 400 years of history. So that's what you see with these panels, and I certainly hope you get an opportunity to look over these things. It's no way to cover a topic like this in that short period of time without talking about some highlights. And the highlight for me is, of course, the Atlantic slave trade, and that shows where the slaves taken from Africa were taken on the Atlantic coast. So a third of all of the Africans went to Brazil, and about 12% of them went to the Caribbean islands and the northern part of South America. There were some that went into Central America and Mexico. And then they didn't begin to bring slaves into these lands until 1619. So something that we all need to spend a little time and just try to understand. The reason this came about was because of greed. It was because of commerce. It wasn't out of hatred or meanness. It was just flat out greed. People taken to Brazil, they were growing sugar cane and tobacco, cotton. They did that in the Caribbean. And what they were doing, and it shows the other map here, they were taking slaves from Africa, and then they were taking sugar and bringing them to the United States. And one of the largest slave depots was in, not a depot, but one of the larger business production things in the early part of the development of these colonies was in Rhode Island. And the significant thing about Rhode Island was that they made rum. And so from the sugar, they had the sugar cane brought into Rhode Island, and then they made rum and sent it to Africa and Europe, and they bought more slaves. And so this thing just kept going around and around. And it wasn't just sugar for rum, but they used sugar for sugar. There was something I was reading that at one point most of the world's cotton came from these lands, and most of that came from South Carolina and Georgia, Mississippi. Texas was a late bloomer in all of this. We seceded from the Union, and we thought we were in good company. But we were the young person in the group. We probably were the last of we were probably the southwesternmost state to join the Union. And that was an interesting thing. Slaves began to show up, and the reason I'm sorry, but the reason I'm dwelling on slavery is because we still are infected with a lot of what happened during this time. And it's both black and white. And you say, well, we're like 3 or 4 or 5 generations removed, and we are. But a lot of the pleasures that surface is a part of that. Blacks were denied education during all of this time. And they were not encouraged to learn anything. And this is a hard thing to overcome. So when the slaves were freed in 1863, 65 for Texas, what would you do? What would they do? They had nothing. You know, most of them didn't own a horse. They didn't own anything. You had no sellable skills. Some of them had sellable skills. But those are all good stories. Those stories how they negotiated, and some movies have been made about those roles. That I've got one of the people on up here who won an award. Hattie McDaniels for Gone with the Wind. She was the first black to win an Oscar. Well, the important thing was not that she just won an Oscar, but the story that was told. And it's a really good story of when what happened when during that period of time when slaves were freed and the war. We have an exhibit at the museum now that talks about the Civil War. I say Civil War. People, some others say war between the states. They, if you treat the states as independent entities, then it was a war between the states. But if you treat the states as a concerted grouping, an agreement of people to form an entity of government, then it was certainly a civil war. Anyway, there were black soldiers that fought on both the Union side and the Southern side, and that's what's at the museum currently. There shouldn't be any dissension or conflict about that, because there were blacks that fought on both sides for the war, the Revolutionary War. Just about every war, if we could have been Japanese, we would have fought on that. You know, it's just one of those things. It's the nature of people. We just can't agree on everything. But it wasn't that people were treated any better. The South said, well, we treat our people well. And the North, they have to fend for themselves. Well, that's the way New York City is. You just got to, if you ever walk down the streets of New York, you got to know where you're going, And there's some lessons in all of that. But anyway, after they freed the slaves, and the big thing, they created the Freedmen's Bureau. And this Lincoln was thinking about, what would happen when these slaves were freed and after the war and everything. And of course, he never really got a chance to realize all of that, because he was killed shortly after the war ended. But the Freedmen's Bureau surfaced, and there are agencies in Texas, and I guess there was one in the southern part of Brazos County. Washington County was a large black population in Washington County, and there was some agents in Leon County, which is next to Robeson County, which was a large population of slaves. Several of these counties, there's seven counties in the Brazos Valley, what make up the Brazos Valley, what we call the Brazos Valley. And they, I think 3 of those counties had black majorities at some point in there, before the war, before the Civil War. But that's fascinating. I think Brazos County, it was 1880 or 1890, one of those censuses, the dominant population was, the majority population was African American. And that just shows the sheer number that were here. They came here for purpose of developing the area. So we were the ones who broke the trees down. Didn't have tractors, so we were the tractors. And that was an interesting part of developing and building this thing. So when you talk about who built America, who built Texas, who built Bryan College Station, then you're wrong if you don't include these people, because they certainly had some input on, and some significant input. Texas A&M initially was built primarily by those people. They were the ones looking for work. They would come up when they moved that railroad track from Milliken, that's what created Bryan. They moved the railroad track going north, and they would stop because they were building the college over here. There were jobs. The college in 1871, I think the Texas created the Public Education Act, and as part of that, they also identified that they were going to take advantage of the Morrell Land Grant Act and create a agricultural and mechanical college here. Now, why was it given here and not somewhere else? Because somebody gave 2,000 acres of land. That's what did it. But anyway, these, it wasn't my, is Bill Page here? Bill is a librarian and he's a scholar. He does a lot of research, and Bill has come up with some interesting things. I think there were 3 families originally recorded in the 1850 census that showed that they owned black slaves and they lived in this area. And it was a Carter and a Carson and Rector family, I think. But they owned some significant slaves. Well, when those people died, they died shortly after the war was over. And those slaves were still in this area and they were working. And slaves were, they were housekeepers and they did those things, but they also were builders and they were, they did all of the things that it took to grow things. I was seeing one of the abolitionists. Did you see that series, The Abolitionists? Well, one of them I was looking at, and it was fascinating. They were sitting around a table like this. And these were all white people sitting around a table, and every one of them had a slave that was fanning them. And this was real. And she was from South Carolina, or one of these families, and they had created this elitist thing. And that's part of the problem that's happened in this country. They weren't people anymore. Somebody needed a salt. And the salt was over on this side. Well, you wouldn't move it over here. That slave had to move it. That's crazy. But that's just the way the world is, or was anyway. So this is, now we've got the university developed, and at the same time, the same law that created E&M created Prairie View. Okay, and the idea, it said it was going to be equal Certainly separate. It was down that river. You know, you take the Brazos River, it goes right through Hempstead, doesn't it? And that's where they found a place to buy, and it created Purview, so it was called Alta Vista. And then later on, it developed, it had the name Purview. And somewhere somewhere doing the research of this thing, I had indicated all the different names that Purview had been over the years. It seemed like every legislature, that was one of their responsibilities, was change the name of Purview. But anyway, it was the first, A&M was the first public institution in Texas for college education. UT was on the books, but they had not appropriated any money for UT. And I think the Civil War just kind of set all that back. And the Morrell Land Grant was available, and it was about to go out, and Texas took advantage of that. But also important in that is your favorite African American, who is Matthew Gaines. And he was a state senator from Brenham. Now, Washington County is one of the adjoining counties of Brazos County. And he was an advocate for education of the slaves, of the former slaves. And nobody says much about it because he didn't author the bill to create the school. But he certainly was an advocate for equal education. And because of that, they went ahead and bought that plantation in Hempstead and created Purview. And we certainly, somewhere between A&M and Purview, there ought to be a statue for Matthew Gaines. College Station, as it continued to grow and develop, the black population didn't really, it wasn't really that identifiable. I mean, it was, people were here and they were functioning and doing things. But Bryan was a city. And up until 1930, you know, when College Station incorporated, and even then, Bryan was still a city. It was where most of commerce was. The movie theaters were there. You know, College Station, I think, as far as the black population, they had maybe one hairdresser and one beer joint and one little grocery store, but that was about it. But Bryan, you'll see, I've shown a map here which indicates the African-American businesses in Bryan. And remember, I told you in the 1890s, the dominant majority population in Bryan was African-American. In the 1900s, they had a Negro Chamber of Commerce. Can you imagine that? And that went on to the 1930s. But that's how sound they were, and that's how large they were, and they functioned. Now, don't ask me what happened, but it was definitely there. And they had other social organizations that were important for any community to develop. And you'll see this. One thing I want to mention, and I'll shut up. The education of African Americans was so severe that in the early 1900s, Tuskegee was created. Now you all know Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and he a couple of years after he was born, the slaves were freed, so he didn't have to experience most of that. But it was still poor for him, and he was in West Virginia, and he eventually went to school at Hampton, which was in Virginia. And his story is a beautiful, beautiful story of what can happen when things. And there was some, and we got a little of it up here about W.B. Du Bois. And of course, you can, just like you got some blacks for the Confederacy and some for the Union, well, you got some for Du Bois and you got some for Booker T. Washington. They had different philosophies at one point as to what would be done, what should be done for the African American population. Now that they're free, ignorant, with moneyless, what do you do with them? How do you, and so they each had a different approach. W.B. Du Bois was first African American to get a PhD at Harvard. So he wasn't just a small guy. I mean, he was a very skilled, talented person. Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, he only graduated from Hampton, but he had good friends. He had friends in high places. He got the ears of the president. And as a result, I've listed all of the people that Booker T. Washington was able to contribute to the cause of education and rural development, rural agricultural development for poor black farmers. And one of those was Julius Rosenwald. And I don't know, have you heard of Julius Rosenwald?
Sears Roebuck.
Okay, several of you. Well, several more of you need to hear it. Julius Rosenwald was the president of Sears and Roebuck. And he originally joined the Sears and Roebuck team when Sears and Roebuck were putting it together. And they died, and he eventually became the president and the top dog, and this was all in the late 1800s. So in the 1900s, he was the person. Sears and Roebuck was really big. I think Montgomery Ward's was a little bit larger, but they both were competing. Sears had a smart thing. Ward's went after the middle class, and Sears went after the poor people. Now, they were both poor whites and poor blacks. So, they had a guaranteed audience. The next thing that they did was they created the big Sears catalog. How many of you remember that catalog? See? And it was used for more than just ordering clothes. But this was so important. Now, what Rosenwald did, he created a foundation, but he had been working very closely with Booker T. Washington, and they had been looking at, Washington had been exploring ways of helping poor black farmers develop and Booker T. Washington did another outstanding thing. He hired George Washington Carver. And George Washington Carver was a scientist. He was a chemist. And what he did was he created something like 400 uses for peanuts. And so what he was doing was coming up with other things that black farmers, these poor black farmers, could do that would help them make a living, have something to sell. He had something to sell. And it was so interesting. They would just grow cotton, grow tobacco, and it kills the soil. So what do? Well, he began a program of soil rotation, which was utilized by white farmers as well. It was just something that was helpful to the whole country. And these were kind of contributions that have come from this sort of thing. But anyway, Rosenwald built over 4,000 schools to educate blacks in the South, in every southern state from Maryland to Texas. Texas has about 400 schools. And up here are two of the schools from Rosenwald. And one of those schools is in Calvert. And if you, next time you go to Calvert, you look for W.D. Speichner. That's the name of the school. And it's no longer part of the Calvert school system. But they've turned it over to some alumni from that school, and they've created an association, and they're going to maintain it. I guess it'll become a museum or a tourist attraction or something. But there were several I think we counted about 16 at one time within this area. And that's the only one that's still standing. But the important thing about those schools is that at one time, 1/3 of all of the blacks educated in the South had attended a Rosenwald school. And I think that's significant. And this was before there was public education. You know, we had public education in Bryan. Remember, I told you the act was in 1870, 71. And they built a school in Bryan in 1885. And that's where the museum sits now, is on the site where the Bryan School for Color was. Well, there was no Bryan School, there was no College Station School for Color. The Lincoln was built in 1940, in the 40s. And that was originally A&M Consolidated School for Color. And up to that point, they went to school in Bryan, the ones in high school. So it's been an interesting kind of relationship between the two cities. I was reading, my source is always Wikipedia. And they were saying that College Station was located in the largest region in the state of Texas. And it was located near 3 of the 10 largest cities in the country. And that was Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. See, I remembered that too. But we were talking about that one day. But anyway, so a lot has changed in the period of time from here, but there have been a lot of positive changes. And I'll name a few. One is, it's hard to believe that if you look at that chart, when they were bringing slaves over from Africa, and we elected the first black president, and then we went back and elected him for a second term. I think that's very significant. And I don't care whether you voted for him or not. Fact is, he was elected. The other thing that's important is the football coach at A&M is black. Now that's significant. These are kind of things that were chiseled in stone. You know, when I went to A&M, there was only 12 blacks on the campus. You know, my big thrill was to be on the elevator with Rudder. Yeah. But things have changed. And I felt a part of that change when she said I'd gone to the Antarctic. And I did. A professor in the oceanography department hired me after I got out of service. And he was, I'm not an oceanographer, but he was preparing as part of the exhibit, they were going to the Antarctic waters and they were going to be looking at all kinds of samples and everything. And you measure all of the dynamics you can. And so his thing was solar radiation. And so I was a part of that because I was going to man the photometers and make sure everything went okay. And just come out of service, that's what I'd done in SAC, was the electronics part of it. So that was valid, that was fine. Then he encouraged me to go to A&M. A&M was trying to recruit as many black people as they could at the time. And it worked out okay. I graduated, and I don't have any regrets for it. It was definitely, initially not my cup of tea. I wasn't in the Corps, and to be a student at A&M, it's not like today. Today you got 50,000 students, you only got 2,000 in the Corps. Then you had just the opposite. You had about 9,000 students, and only 2 or 3%. It was the 2%ers. They weren't in the Corps. And of course I was in that group. So it was kind of an interesting thing. But my experiences at UT, which were almost 10 years difference, well, some years difference anyway. It was, I was an angry, feisty person, I was, Heman Sweat filed suit to integrate the University of Texas Law School. And so I had that kind of anger. Well, we hadn't improved too much from when Sweat was there. We had gotten into separate rooms, separate dormitories. Sweat lived in a YMCA. Yeah. Professors came to the YMCA to give him classes. So he couldn't even go into a classroom. So things have changed completely. But anyway, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I do hope you'll have a chance to look through some of these.